should also say I am the, I am the president of the National Association for Research and Therapy of Homosexuality, NARTH, current president. So I would be remiss not to mention that, since that was part of what brought me here. Do want to talk to you today, hopefully briefly, about issues regarding scientific integrity and harm in this whole area of sexual orientation change efforts, which I will refer to as SOCI, and how I believe that there is really what we're seeing in this area is a triumph of advocacy over science. And it all starts, I'm going to see if I can do this right. Yeah, it all starts in my book with the report of the American Psychological Association Task Force on Appropriate Therapeutic Responses to Sexual Orientation. Now, I should say I have been a member of the American Psychological Association in good standing, at least hopefully that will continue, but since 1984. So I've been involved in the APA a long time, have been to several conferences, presented at the APA conference on a few occasions. So there is a lot of good in the organization. I don't see it as all bad. But when it comes to these social issues, I'm afraid the science is being compromised. So this report from the task force, as I'm sure many of you or most of you are all familiar with, it is considered and still is considered today the authoritative analysis on the subject of sexual orientation change efforts. But I would submit to you that the report's objectivity is demonstrably suspect. And as a result of that, its portrayal of the relevant literature in this area concerning the efficacy and harm from sexual orientation change efforts is neither complete nor definitive. And I want to talk about two examples of this in particular. One has to do with how task force members were selected, and the second has to do with, within the report, the different evidentiary standards used to evaluate SOCI efficacy and SOCI harm. So in terms of the bias in the task force selection, I wonder if you knew or know that there were many qualified conservative psychologists nominated to serve on this task force, a few from NARTH, but many others as well, and every single one of them was rejected. And what we were left with was that only psychologists unsympathetic to SOCI were appointed, and we know for a fact that 5 of the 6 of the task force members were lesbian, gay, or bisexual identified, and all 6 were unsympathetic to SOCI. In fact, when asked about this, the Clinton Anderson, who is the director of APA's LGB Concerns Office, he defended the decision in the selection process by saying the following: "We cannot take into account what are fundamentally negative religious perspectives of homosexuality. They don't fit into our worldview." I think from that you can see that the APA was operating with a litmus test. No affirming views of SOCI or non-affirming views of homosexual practice would be allowed. And as a result of this, the report fails to include any religious resources that adopt a traditional or conservative approach to addressing conflicts between religious beliefs and sexual orientation. What you find is a few pages full of resources to gay affirmative churches, religious groups, spiritual groups, but nothing that would resemble anything that would have a traditional Christian sexual ethic in it. So, as far as bias in the different evidentiary standards for efficacy and harm, what we find is that the report utilizes, when you read it in detail, very exceptionally rigorous methodological standards for assessing SOCI outcomes, in other words, how effective it is, and considerably less rigorous and uneven standards in assessing for potential harms. Reference is made to many problems in the literature, it's mostly older literature, that supports SOCI, and these are deemed to render these studies virtually useless. And they refer to things like convenience samples, participants not being blind to the study purposes, no control groups. They demand randomized control studies to really say you can have this treatment, when in fact there are plenty of treatments that have not undergone randomized control studies. And yet, the report, the task force, is ready to overlook these same kind of limitations when the findings support preferred conclusions regarding harm. It really is amazing to see folks still refer to Evelyn Hooker's 1957 study, which just practically every single complaint that the APA task force had against the SOCI literature occurs in the Hooker study, and yet it is still touted as a groundbreaking study. So the conclusions of the report do seem to fluctuate significantly. And they present us with, and seem to affirm, two incompatible assertions. One is that we do not have credible evidence on which to judge the likelihood of sexual orientation change and potential harm. On the other hand, we know with scientific certainty that sexual orientation change is unlikely, and many are harmed. And some quotes from the report kind of bear this out. Say, for instance, we conclude that there is little in the way of evidence that could clarify whether SOCI does or does not work in changing same-sex attractions. Similarly, we cannot conclude how likely it is that harm will occur from SOCI. But then later in the report, the results of scientifically valid research indicate that it is unlikely that individuals will be able to reduce same-sex attractions or increase other sex attractions through SOCI. So this is the kind of unevenness that tells me there are significant problems with the way this report was developed. Let's talk about harm as it's represented in the political arena, and being from California, I'm very knowledgeable about the law that was passed, California Senate Bill 1172. It was passed in, I believe it was the spring of 2013. And Narth, as well as myself, are plaintiffs. We sued the state of California, and this law is currently going up to the Supreme Court. But you see there Senator Ted Lieu, who was a state senator in California, who has basically introduced this bill into the legislature. And on the right, you can see, I think this was a picture from one of his press releases, characterizing what SOCI is, what SOCI practitioners believe, that it's just simply, we just switch it on and off, that's all we do. So you can see it's really a horrible mischaracterization and complete oversimplification of professional practice of SOCI. Now, Senator Lieu had a quote. It was quoted in a newspaper, and I'm going to share that with you. But I ask, as you read this quote, are we talking about harms, or is it really hysteria? So his quote is as follows: "The attack on parental rights is exactly the whole point of the bill, because we don't want to let parents harm their children. For example, the government will not allow parents to let their kids smoke cigarettes. We also won't have parents let their children consume alcohol at a bar or a restaurant." So he's making this equivalency argument. And I thought to myself, we could actually get some data to see how legitimate this equivalence argument is. And so I compared the scientific basis for harms from youth from smoking, alcohol, and SOCI. And basically what I did was looked at abstract, did a keyword search in both the Psych Articles database and the Medline database. Psych Articles includes every article ever published in APA journals, as well as many other psychiatric and psychological journals. Medline database includes all the major medical journals. And here's what I came up with, you can see on the screen. For children, adolescents, alcohol, cigarettes. And as you can see, the literature regarding youth and harm from alcohol and cigarettes is extensive, with studies numbering in the thousands. So you can be pretty sure it's a replicated and reliable result. You could say science has could reach a consensus about this. So then I entered into this keyword search, SOCI, children SOCI, adolescent SOCI, as well as other terms that have been used for SOCI, such as reparative therapy, conversion therapy, reorientation therapy. Those are terms that have been used for a longer period of time, just to see what the comparison rates were of articles. And here's what came up. Rather astounding, I would say. So, what we see from that is that in contrast to the thousands of articles related to alcohol and cigarette usage by youth, my search yielded only 4 articles that addressed sexual orientation change in youth. Worse than that, 3 of these articles were not research-oriented, basically a few case studies. And one of these even appeared supportive of change efforts from the 70s. There's only one study that suggested harms, which was, of course, Shidlow and Schroeder. And as many of you know, this study specifically recruited for participants who had felt harmed by their SOCI experience, so really couldn't be generalized. And I concluded from these findings that Senator Liu's comparisons lacked merit scientifically. And I think Senator Liu's handlers did too, because I didn't see him quoted ever again after that as the bill was going on. Now, as we talk about harm, it's important to say, what is the context for harm? Usually these threats of harm or these accusations of harm are thrown out without a context at all from the scientific literature. And what we know is that there are currently no data that scientifically establish the prevalence rate of harm with SOCI. And so critics generally refer to the potential for harm, or that the risk of harm is somehow significant, even though we really don't have any way of knowing. And of course, this language, I know it is utilized in the UKCP's conversion therapy consensus statement, as well as the Royal College of Psychiatrists' position statement on sexual orientation. It's repeatedly utilized. And basically, SOCI is considered poor practice by definition. So never is the question of harm placed in the broader context of the rates of harm from psychotherapy in general. It seemed to me that would be kind of an important thing to know, does it not? And so the proper context for harm, there is some literature on this, and it suggests that 5 to 10% of adult clients across all forms of psychotherapy are worse off after treatment. And since this bill in California was specifically related to adolescents or minors, it's even more important to note that the deterioration rates are between 14 to 24% when you're talking about children and adolescents in psychotherapy. Beyond that, 40 to 60% of youth drop out of psychological treatment prematurely, which could also result in distress if they haven't finished a course of treatment that was designed to, help them, and that continuing on perhaps would have led to a positive result, but they terminated abruptly. So probably out of that, there is also an increase in the distress you're going to find. So what do these numbers mean? To me, they mean that, therefore, results of harm significantly higher than these figures would be needed. We'd have to obtain them from representative samples of SOCI consumers in order for approach-specific harms to be substantiated. Otherwise, critics of SOCI are simply targeting one approach to psychological care, not on scientific grounds, but rather for ideological and political reasons. Now, the last thing I'm going to do is bring to you, you may not have heard, but there is some new research coming out. When I did my database searches, this research was not in there. There is some new research coming out, and you need to know about it because you're going to be hearing about it. There are at least 3 newly published or about to be published studies on SOCI, which, in my estimation, reincarnate the advocacy research of Shidlow and Schroeder. Study by Flinte, Heck, and Cochran, which was published in 2013. I've already seen this study utilized in some accusations against SOCI in legal and public policy circles in the States. Another study that's only out in online form right now, it will be published in journal form shortly, and that is The Dahlin, Gallagher, Bradshaw, Hyde, and Crowell. The references are in the back of the last slide, so you can check this out. And then finally, there's a study by Bradshaw, Dahlin, Crowell, Gallagher, and Bradshaw. And I had to request this from one of the authors, one of the researchers, and I think I was fortunate they didn't know who I was, so they sent me a copy of it. But I'm very grateful for that, because this last study in particular says it advertises itself as addressing professional SOCI in particular. So, as I mentioned, expect that these studies are going to be heralded uncritically by the UKCP, the RCP, the mainstream media, and activists as supporting claims of widespread harm and general ineffectiveness of SOCI. And yet, significant methodological limitations of these studies make such broad conclusions scientifically unjustifiable, and I'm going to show you that. Well, there are a lot of problems, and actually I've written a piece for the NARTH website. You can go on and if you'd like anytime and read it in detail, much more than I'm going to give you now. But there are at least three main limitations with these studies. First, they're highly non-representative samples. Second, they use compromised outcome measures. And third, they confound the various forms of SOCI that are being studied. So limitation one, highly non-representative samples. There we go. Flente and colleagues recruited through unspecified listservs 38 individuals who identified as ex-gay at the time of their SOCI experience, but who identified as ex-gay at the time of the study. Meanwhile, Dahlin and Bradshaw recruited 1,612 current or former members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, LDS. You have to keep in mind, at the time of their study, 91% of participants identified as lesbian, gay, or bisexual, and 73% were disaffected from the LDS Church. They'd either been expelled or had attending very sporadically. So what would be the concern about these samples? I want you to consider an analogy. What if researchers had surveyed religiously disaffected former marital therapy patients who had subsequently divorced about the harms and effectiveness of this therapeutic modality? Would the use of the results of such a study to make sweeping conclusions about the potential harms and ineffectiveness of marital therapy be a fair and scientifically justified use of the findings? To go further, keep in mind that the marital therapist is not trying to cure an illness, but rather is frequently attempting to help clients live their lives in a manner consistent with their religious beliefs about the sanctity of marriage. Beyond that, these religious clients' deeply held moral values may in fact lead them to remain in a distressful marriage and pursue therapy for their marriage long after other clients would have opted for divorce. Kind of see where I'm going here. And yet, the choices of such clients to seek marital therapy are not ipso facto assumed by the profession to be based on internalized divorce negativity or cultural maritalism, and thereby invalidated, despite the additional emotional stress which may come from remaining in their marriages. I think that the fact that SOCI is not treated in a similar manner gives some indication to the political and advocacy influences that are in play within the mental health associations. Let's talk about compromised outcome measures. The Dahlin and Bradshaw studies use the following 5-point outcome scale for participant ratings of their SOCI experience. This is the major outcome measure that they used. On their scale, 1 was highly effective, 2 was moderately effective, 3 not effective, 4 moderately harmful, and 5 severely harmful. It was a 5-point scale. There we go. Can you see a problem with this scale? Well, yes. You're on track. It is highly unusual for a single scale, and I can't think of any that I've seen, to evaluate two entirely different dimensions at the same time, harm and effectiveness in this case. Normally, you would want to utilize two different scales to get these outcome ratings. And in that, one scale would have the endpoints of highly effective and highly ineffective, while the other scale would likely have endpoints something like significantly beneficial and significantly harmful. I would have liked to see a 7-point scale. Generally speaking, that's more utilized because you get more variance and a more clear picture. But it was only a 5-point scale. And as some of you, I think, were noting, the scale midpoint, which was not effective, is also quite problematic. The researchers commented that the survey took about over an hour to do for most of the participants. But there's a thing called midpoint response bias, and this occurs when respondents who are in a hurry or uncertain or have no opinion simply endorse the middle response to get on with it. And I think this would likely inflate, in the present case, the ineffectiveness ratings of these studies. And my question to the authors and to you, what might the results have looked like had the authors made an equally arbitrary decision to label the midpoint option not harmful instead of not effective? So you get a little idea here how science is done and how a lot really hinges on how one operationalizes your variables. This is never going to make it. You never have a discussion like this in the Times, that's for sure. But it's important to be aware of it. And third, the confounding of various forms of SOCI. Confounding occurs where an outcome is attributed to one factor when in actuality it is being fully or partially confused with another factor. Now, all the studies, these new studies involve participants who had engaged in multiple forms of SOCI. And these were forms that involve such things as private religious practices like prayer or Bible study, as well as counseling by church leaders. And in fact, those types of SOCI were far more common than professional therapist-led SOCI. And even where that last study by Bradshaw purport to study professional SOCI, they have to acknowledge the participants averaged 3.7 additional forms of SOCI intervention. So the Dahlin and Bradshaw studies, they did find greater risk of harm with SOCI involving religious leaders. But I will tell you that even this finding is deceptive. So if you're a clergyman or a clergywoman who does this kind of work, don't panic by this study. Because these studies involve participants with an LDS background. And as I understand it anyway, typically the typical LDS local church authority is a bishop who has not obtained a theological or pastoral graduate education. Instead, most bishops anyway are chosen from among male members in good standing with the church who have shown themselves to be competent and successful with their families and vocations. Thus, it's entirely possible the unflattering results of these studies regarding church counseling forms of SOCI may well reflect not a particularly surprising result. Namely, that religious individuals in conflict about their same-sex attractions are at greater risk of harm when their SOCI counselor is, for example, trained as a plumber or a banker. The likely confounding of personal, religious, and professional forms of SOCI and participants' ratings make it virtually impossible to draw definitive conclusions, particularly about professional SOCI. So I hope you're feeling a little bit more armed, knowing how to respond when these studies start to get mentioned. Okay, great. I'm almost done. So what are some conclusions, real quickly? Well, the Shidlow and Schroeder explicitly recruited former SOCI clients who felt harmed by their experience with predictable findings. But at least I give them credit. At least they were willing to explicitly and emphatically emphasize their inability to generalize beyond their sample. In fact, they said, the data presented in this study do not provide information on the incidence and prevalence, the failure, success, harm, help, or ethical violations in conversion therapy. At least that's honest. The authors of these new studies, however, are far more willing to draw conclusions and make recommendations that they have no assurance can actually be supported beyond their own studies' participants. No doubt, and I'm sure Narth and other SOCI proponents would welcome this research were it utilized to offer guidance within the bounds of its limitations. And I think, to my mind, that would be guidance such as the need for therapists to, 1, provide SOCI within traditional ethical standards of their professions, 2, recognize the limitations, to recognize the limitations of our current scientific understanding of sexual orientation change, and 3, to offer up-to-date education on sexual orientation and SOCI to conservative religious communities. So finally, unfortunately, the authors of the studies examined in this review have largely not chosen to take the measured, scientifically accurate and measured approach of Shidlow and Schroeder. Rather, they offer what appear to be advocacy-emboldened recommendations that support the further professional marginalization and legal prohibition of professional SOCI. So my concluding thought on this is that simply, were we to apply the rigorous methodological standards of the APA task force to these studies, these new studies that are coming, scientific integrity and consistency would have us have to conclude that they do not meaningfully advance the discussion on the issues of SOCI harm and effectiveness. Thank you.